All right, welcome back to Tuesday Morning Pastor's Corner. This is episode 9 of our roundtable discussion on biblical masculinity. As a definition, we were talking about the traits, characteristics, and responsibilities that are unique to adult human males according to the Word of God. Last time we met, we discussed men as husbands and found out that the leading concept there as a husband is sacrificial, not domineering. We do not lead by oppressing those who are that we're responsible for. That it's more about responsibility than taking your personal rights, and that you sacrifice your rights in order to provide for your wives. And submission is actually supposed to be to one another within the roles that God prescribed. So, in certain areas, that men are supposed to submit to their wives' leadership and responsibilities that they're responsible for. And of course, wives are supposed to submit to their husbands based upon what they are prescribed and responsible for. Today, we are going to discuss men as fathers. Now, we're going to jump right into this one because this is a very important discussion, and I think a place where a lot of men miss. Looking back at the history, especially the 1900s to the 1970s, 80s, I think in portrayal of a kind of an incorrect model of what fathers are supposed to be. So I want to be able to kind of open that up a little bit, allow you guys to kind of freeform this out a little bit, just ask a few questions and hopefully get some really engaging conversation. Why is most, I'm going to borrow this from Brad. I think that's probably the best question I think I've seen in your book. Now, you get asked a lot of good questions, but I think this is one of the best ones. Why are most of the prescriptions about parenting, both Old Testament and New Testament, addressed to fathers and not to mothers? Now, Brad, you can obviously answer this question, but Jacob, do you have an initial idea or a thought here about why it would be addressed to fathers in particular and not to just always being to both parents or to mothers?
I think it would be because of the headship of the man over the home, not in a relationship to God standpoint. Man's not closer to God than the woman, but it seems that the text suggests that man has been set over the household. And so, with that, the parenting responsibility, while being shared, seems to fall under the responsibilities of the father.
So an ultimate responsibility. It's like the buck stops there.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Luther, do you have an idea? Thought?
I think it reflects kind of an aspect of the nature of God. Again, we see the example of God being called the Father throughout various passages of Scripture, right? And how he is kind of he is the model, the excellence model. I think for how fathers ought to conduct themselves, how they ought to see the world around them, how they ought to care, provide, protect, as God does. So I think that there's kind of an element to where the reason why fathers are addressed is because that's an aspect of his nature, and his character. And as men who adopt this vocation, I think that that underscores a character or nature of God that we really kind of don't talk about, but it's underscored in Scripture in various texts.
It reminds me of he's the good shepherd, and pastors take on that function as shepherds. But I love what Peter calls them, and we're like shepherdlings. So we're like the mini shepherd. So I just wrote down. I just thought it was cute. I'm not sure if it's necessarily biblical, but we're fatherlings. We're basically just representing the Father in our fatherhood, and we're supposed to. And what I think a lot of people miss is that we're supposed to be the representation of God. And a lot of children get their impression of who God is based upon the relationship with the parents, specifically the father. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And at least the statistics I've seen bear that out. is that, people with an absentee father think of God as absentee, people with an abusive father to think of God as abusive. So it's God's design, I mean, really, to teach us about himself through those natural functions that he has made and those natural institutions that he has created. They are designed to show us who he is and what it's meant to be. So of course all earthly fathers will fall short. But I think the other reason that God shows us and addresses fathers first and foremost is when we talk about the motherless epidemic. It's certainly out there, that's problematic, but the fatherless epidemic is far more consistent and consistently seen throughout human history. The reality is that husbands are more likely to disengage from the children than are wives. Wives feel that natural and have that natural, or mothers, that natural biological connection to children. And it is simply a greater risk that men will disengage and let mom do all the work and not really engage in bringing their children up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So I think that there is a really important feature in which God is diagnosing one of the problems that happens when sin enters our lives, is that men will tend to disengage from that most important and most uncomfortable part of life. And I mean uncomfortable because, you go to work and the rules are very, much more defined, the roles are more defined, but you're dealing with your kids, all of a sudden you've got all sorts of conflict issues. You got to teach them to respect, you got to teach them to obey. Those aren't really fun things to teach. So what do most men do? Well, they abdicate. We duck out, we let our wives do the heavy lifting, and that causes tremendous injury, I believe, to the child, both in terms of their understanding of God as well as their ability to function within society. And then clearly that becomes a self-replicating cycle, because a young man who has not been modeled good fatherhood is even less likely to be able to produce that in the context of his own family when he becomes a father.
That's kind of strange. That's exactly where my mind went. Usually instructions follow need. It's like mothers are oftentimes inherently motherly. Fathers, and it's depicted, in all of history, where they'll come home, they'll take care of business, they'll father a child, then they'll go to work, they'll go to travel, they'll go take care of what they need to take care of. And if they do come home every once in a while, it's like 5 minutes involvement with their children, pat them on the head. I think of like Mary Poppins, and the father just come home from work, pat him on the head, go to bed. Where's the engagement? Where's the fatherhood there? And so I oftentimes, when I look at instruction, I look at it from the perspective of that there's a need there. And so I do think that fathers oftentimes in a biblical framework need to be told, you're responsible for engaging and raising your children, not just your wife. I think it's a very good point. And it's already been kind of stated, as fathers, who are we supposed to model after? And we've already kind of answered it, but we'll go ahead and answer it again. Who's the model? It's God the Father, right?
Yeah, it's in Ephesians there, and I think Herbert Honer's work on this was really pretty important. He pointed out that God is the Father of all fatherhood, right? And or from the Father from whom whichever family is named. I believe that Honer's correct in his interpretation that what is really being said in a rather obscure statement is that God the Father is the Father of fatherhood. He is the primary example of all that fatherhood is to be, or maybe putting it the other way around, that fatherhood is designed as an emanation and a reflection of his character. Therefore, a good father or a successful father isn't the father that everyone necessarily likes or that a society prefers. A good father is a father who's modeled after the character and design of God. And I think that implies, if not demands, that we come to know, how did God father the nation of Israel? How does God father the people? What are his methods? Because I think we'll find that they're maybe not in line with our natural human expectations, as we see how, God fathered his wayward earthly people Israel, and how he continues to act as a father to us.
Excellent. But in contrast to that, who do we normally model?
Ward Cleaver.
Ha! Or our own fathers, right?
Right.
I mean, I can't tell you, I think we all struggle. and and we have generations of this, right, where we try to break bad habits of our previous generation, but we often carry them through, and we think we're doing better a lot of times, and all of a sudden you wake up, and all of a sudden you start saying something to your kids. You go, wait a second, I'm sounding like my father, because we default back to what we kind of grew up with. And I would say that even if you had a great father, even if he is a good role model, the ultimate role model has to be God. And so if we talk about role model, we talk about, who we're supposed to emulate, we're supposed to function in this manner, then I do think that not looking at the fathers in the Bible necessarily, because a lot of them were not successful, or we don't get a good picture of exactly what they did and bring them up. We get prescription, but I think if we're going to look at role model as far as fathers go, then yes, I agree with you that we need to look at God the Father and how he functioned. Obviously, being God is different, and looking after a nation is different, but there are principles that are found that are necessary.
And I
So,
think that's really encouraging,
well,
by the way. Oh,
but
Well, that's why the communicable attributes of God are so important, is because the attributes that he shares with us are the ones that we ought to focus on. We can't focus on being omnipresent. We don't have that ability. We can't focus on, being eternal. We don't have that characteristic, but we can focus on those things. For instance, mercy and love and goodness and peace and even justice to some degree. That if you do this, this is the consequence you get. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. So I think that if the communicable attributes of God are sourced in him, well then, and if God is known as the Father, logically speaking, then those attributes that we adopt will make us consistent, intentional fathers, because we are striving to share those attributes, or at least reflect those attributes that he has shared with us, right? So that I think focusing on that, it actually helps. It's a comfort, I think.
and adding to that, I mean, to me, there's incredible comfort in this, because it would be very easy. In fact, I've met many young men who fear to enter into fatherhood, or don't even want to have kids at all, because they had a bad example or no example. And it is a wonderful blessing that you can say, no, your earthly father, whether excellent or very poor, was only a signpost to lead you to ultimately know your heavenly Father. And therefore, the unbeliever, or rather, sorry, the person without a father, or without a good father figure, still has the ultimate and access to the ultimate example and guidance of our heavenly Father. So it really leaves us in a place of hopefulness that those cycles can be broken. It leaves us in a place of positivity that by the power of Christ and the working of the Holy Spirit and the Word, that people who have had no good example will have an opportunity to imitate and replicate that which is given from God. That's a big punch, a big shot in the arm, I think, in terms of hopefulness. And in fact, in this way, as Will, you so well alluded, the person with a bad or no example may even have an edge, because I love my dad. I am constantly shaped by my dad's opinion and so on. And where that departs from godliness, as it will with all of us, it's more difficult for me to recommend or recognize. And so we see in this reality that God has truly provided everything we need for life and godliness in this regard, in claiming us as his own and identifying us as his children, and specifically taking on that incredibly intimate leadership role as our Father.
That's I liken it to individuals who have no training in a specific area versus somebody who comes in with bad training. It's hard to break bad habits. And so if you can actually get a hold of somebody and give them the example of God the Father, who has not a real good example of a father, knows that I'm not supposed to be this, what am I supposed to be? And actually it's adapt to learning and understanding exactly what the responsibilities are. But fantastic. The getting into the specifics though, you have a lot of verses down, and I found it very enlightening that you first went to Proverbs, to understand the responsibilities of a father, not to the typical Ephesians, even some portions in Colossians, other epistles, but Proverbs. I found that to be very again enlightening. Oh, you know what? That's not what I would have done, and I have to stand corrected because I think that is perfect. And so, in what way, I would say, should we use? Because a lot of people, like the New Testament churches, they get all bent out of shape when you start using Old Testament for principle. Which I tell people all the time, says being under the law, being under grace, is not what you think it is. That the law is that there's certain concepts within the Old Testament, principles and ideas that are valuable and are necessary, and you can learn from that. Luther just taught the book of Ecclesiastes, one of the highest prescription books you can actually read. Tells us exactly what we're supposed to think, it's supposed to tell us what we're supposed to do. And so Proverbs, I equate that a lot as well. Wisdom in literature, getting understanding. And my son, observe the commandment of your father, do not forsake the teaching of your mother. A wise son makes a father glad, a foolish son is a grief to his mother. A wise son accepts his father's discipline, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. He who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. And a lot of people say, well, you shouldn't use these passages, you should go to Ephesians. Well, that's what Ephesians says. I like this, obviously within a little bit different language, a little bit cadence, being a wisdom literature. It's exactly what Ephesians says. So I think it's valuable to understand the complete picture. Many times within the New Testament, they encapsulate ideas into more they condense it down into concepts where you get something like, Proverbs 13, it gives us a lot more information to work with. So with that being said, give everyone an opportunity here. How would you characterize, or what are the primary characteristics, responsibilities, actions of fathers according to Scripture? Where would you go? How would you go about this? How would you start to classify these particular traits?
If I go ahead, Luther.
Go ahead, Jacob.
Well, I want to take a short step back because I guess to answer that question, I think it comes down to hermeneutics, and that sounds strange, but as you were sharing some of those principles in Proverbs, I was thinking about our theology can determine how we perceive God. And if how we perceive God leads to how we behave as fathers, that could be serious. So, for example, if we have a cosmic deterministic view of God, we're going to be a hardline, authoritative father. And I've seen so many experiences of fathers who did that to their children, and those children no longer walk with the Lord. They no longer love the Lord. Rather than if we understand that God does guide us, he corrects us, he brings us back, he rebukes us, corrects us, but otherwise gives us freedom to fail, to succeed, those sort of things, offers counsel and wisdom to guide. And so in an indirect way, I think I answer the question that we have to first get our recipe for success and understanding God in order to father accurately.
So build a good theology.
Yeah.
Theology proper.
And that's hard because it's not like you have to reach that before you can be a good dad, but as you're dadding, you're building that accurate perspective of God, and you make the changes, and that's where grace comes in, and being transparent with your children of your failures maybe in the past, or hey, I used to handle you this way, that was wrong, or I need to be doing this and I struggle. That's I think another component.
Luther?
I don't think I would necessarily change anything other than the order, because Ephesians, the passage in Ephesians and Colossians and stuff like that tells us the what, right, and the how. So, or the why rather, the what and the why. So, it gives me, as a dad, it gives me kind of the structure by how I ought to approach this particular vocation. right? That I not exasperate my child, right? Frustrate them, neglect them, things like that, but to be intentional in how I parent them, right? And even by extension, the way that I treat, my missus, right? As, that's an example to them, on how they are to build and establish healthy relationships. But I think the Proverbs tells us the how. The how. It is the mechanics, right? So how do I love my wife, right? I can look to Proverbs for that. How do I intentionally raise my child? Even the form of Proverbs and how it's written, I kind of imagine, when Solomon is writing this, I picture like, uh, in my own mind, his son is getting ready to go off to college, right? And he's kind of taking him and walking him along the beach. Hey, son, before you go, I need to share some things with you. I know we've went through them. We've talked about them many, many times, but this is probably one of the last times we're going to have together as we usually do. So I want to share with you some things, right? And kind of give you the recap as to what this is, so that you can make wise decisions while you live. I kind of see Ephesians as the what and the why, and then Proverbs is the how. How do I do this? Well, you do it with the information that the wisdom that God has given you, to teach them. So I don't know if I wouldn't necessarily change anything. But I think again, as Bradley mentioned before, I think it's an incredible comfort to know that I don't have to figure this out on my own. I don't have to trial and error, although I'll make tons of errors, but I don't have to, I don't have to purposefully do that. It's laid out for me to be informed of, so that I can make consistent decisions and intentional ones.
Yeah, well, wise man learns from his mistakes. A man does. Sorry, a wise man learns from the mistakes of others, and we have examples throughout all of history. Rather than having to go through and learn on your own and make mistakes and have to repair them, you can actually get the training to be a parent. We and that's kind of a failure on our part too, is not because what's often says, "Oh, I'm not ready to be a dad." Ah, you'll never be ready. You know, well, that's maybe not necessarily true. That if we actually are actively working on, as fathers and as pastors, trying to help individuals learn what a father is and answering those questions, being proactive against that. Say, hey, found out that somebody is having a baby. Hey, you want to go ahead and take some classes, or get together a little bit and talk about fatherhood and motherhood, and help people understand those responsibilities and roles from Scripture, so that they have a built-in training model. It's not tell you how to change a diaper, but one of the things that I love what Luther said is that you're the example of relationships, not just of the Heavenly Father, but you are responsible for training your children on how to interact with people. And if you're just bombastic and harsh and angry, your kids are going to be bombastic, harsh, and angry. So that's fantastic.
If I may, I would also just want to point out that one of the things that we do well in our camp is distinguish between Old Testament truth and New Testament truth, what applies to us and what doesn't. So obviously the ceremonial, sacrificial, these laws that have to do with the governance of Israel are not applicable to us, right? We're not trying to figure out how to do the sacrifices or whatever that means from the Old Testament concept. And yet at the same time, I think we oftentimes err on the other side, fall off the other side of the horse, and forget that God is revealing his entire world. I mean, he says, wisdom he had at the beginning of his way before he created anything else. He created the way in which things are going to work together meaningfully. So when we come to God's revelation on, let's say, fatherhood or family relationships in general, we're looking at transdispensational truth. We're not, and this is really critical, right? I mean, if we get a this blasphemous term, a New Testament Christian, someone who thinks that they can have a meaningful interaction or relationship with God apart from his revelation of himself and his design in the Old Testament, that person needs to be thrown out the window. I mean, this is insane. You cannot have a full rounded picture of God or God's plan for the world with just the epistles or just the New Testament. We need God's full revelation. We need the full counsel of God. We need to understand responsibly how to apply that. But when it
Mhm.
comes to the Proverbs, particularly, I mean, it's not even a hermeneutical challenge much, if not most of the time. The principles put forth in Proverbs are truly godly wisdom that opposes worldly wisdom, and they give us the information that we otherwise would not have. And so, again, back to Jacob's excellent point, it is a hermeneutical question, and if Christians are walking around without the admonitions of the Book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs, and Job, then they are walking around in incompleteness. They're walking around with a substandard view of God's whole full plan and expectation. So when it comes to these important proverbs, it is, I think, mission critical for us if we're going to succeed in God's designed institution of fatherhood, doing it God's way, that we have to heed God's word about that. And there is no sense, and in fact, I've heard this very frequently, especially amongst those who want to remove, usually because of their own personal wounding, the disciplinary and teaching aspects of fatherhood, because that, again, they felt like they were over disciplined, or maybe their dad hurt their feelings or something like that, which is certainly legitimate. I'm not trying to downplay that experience. They're ultimately given up, or have given up part of, and possibly the most important part of, the fatherhood role, which is, I'm not your buddy, I'm not your friend, I'm here to teach you and guide you into constructive godliness and meaningful adulthood. And that comes both through the instruction of the word, which means that the father has to be in the word, and in that disciplinary action, which in younger times might be physical discipline, and moves on towards, again, that idea of discipline, which we've already talked about, a discipline that encourages someone to greater growth and ability. And I love that proverb that says, he just, forsakes his rod, hates his child, because that's exactly what most fathers do. They hate their children. They hate the bother. They hate the distraction from whatever it is that pleases them. And so they choose not to react altogether or interact altogether, because, oh my goodness, it's just such a pain to discipline my child and deal with the crying and the I hate you daddies, of that important task. And what is it? Well, it's self-love is what it is. It's being totally self-serving. There's no sacrificial nature in which the nice dad succeeds in his task.
So going through the characteristics, responsibilities, and actions, just kind of picking up a lot of the things you're saying here, that we would all agree that love is a primary characteristic of a father. Of course,
But not Fifi love, right?
right. What is the actual? Let's go ahead and state it out. What is the definition of love?
It is executing actions for the need of another at the expense of your own welfare. So you're not just loving the person simply because it makes them feel good, but that can be part of it, of course, or the result of it. But you are working for the benefit of that person based upon their needs, right? So and then adding at the expense of your own. I love what you had said, Brad, that he who spares the rod hates his son. I think about not just the individuals who are left being single mothers, right? That individuals have abdicated their responsibility completely. They hate their children as a result of them not living intentionally for their children. But at the same time, too, you also bring up the individuals that are insulated. They live at home, but are not interacting meaningfully with their children. Like, hey, I'm providing for this house with having a job. What do you want from me? You know what I'm saying? That's also an expression of distaste, hatred towards your progeny. You know what I'm saying? And it's always been a wonder to me, coming out of that particular, area, that, how could anyone, who who has a daughter or a son and sees this human being, this one person that bears all of their features and all of their characteristics physically, and the potential that's there, to just go, nah, I have better things to do with my time. I just that is, you are right. I wouldn't even call it, it's not even a love of self, it's a hatred of self. It's not even self-love. It's a hatred, because they, the person doesn't even see the value, the intrinsic nature and worth of the person that they created, physically. It's just, yes, it is. That was a great point that you brought up, that there's hatred there indeed for those who don't intentionally live that way.
On the aspect of love, one of the things I like to point out is that love has to be for what you understand the benefit to be. You can't just love somebody in your own mind as, okay, this is what you want, and it's not what they want, it's not what they need. It's, we deal with a lot of times from our own perception. We have to understand what the needs of the child are, and we look at it and go, well, they need to eat, they need clothes, they want to have a new iPad, so I'll go work all these extra hours, I'll make all this extra money, I'll provide them these gifts. And they may want that on the surface, but what they really need, what is their true benefit, is to be having an engaging father. That's something I had to learn. When my kids were young, I worked hard to be able to actually provide for them. We're coming out of 3 children in 24 months. We had a lot of kids, we're making a lot of money, so I worked a lot. And I even worked 2 jobs for a while. And I had to come to a point in time where I go, it's actually not working. We have the money, but I'm not there. I'm not engaged. I'm not being a good father. And so actually trying to intentionally think about your family, your children, and to figure out exactly what they need so that you meet those needs, and then sacrifice your own desires in order to be able to do that. Fantastic. So I love self-sacrifice. I think go hand in hand. There's a word that came up, and we've talked about it briefly in other sessions before, but I do think that it's a good question here, because I think we get a misconception. The one who withholds his rod hates his son. Now, of course, that the most common concept of rod is a beating stick, right? To take the rod, beat the children. Name them if you have to. I have several up there. I have several rods. I beat the children on a regular basis. Obviously, that's not what this is intending. Does anybody want to enlighten us a little bit on what the rod is?
Well, the word for rod there is the same word used for scepter, or translated scepter elsewhere. It is a symbol of authority. So again, I'd be a firm advocate that there needs to be loving physical discipline early on, because that's the way that you access a young soul. That's how they process information. And a spanking should never cause, or some kind of physical discipline should never cause harm or injury to the child. Just put some mild physical discomfort into the situation so that idea that this is a bad action should be enforced. And I think that's been abused in so many situations that we've become maybe rightfully gun shy and fearful of abusive parenting. And I think we should be, standing deeply and profoundly against any kind of true physical abuse that causes real harm, that is to say, real physical harm to the child. And I think that's where there's a lot of balance or imbalance in the discussion, because the suggestion is that causing any physical discomfort is somehow abusive, and that's untrue. But on the same side, the idea that somehow you'll be successful as a parent because you caused physical discomfort in your child, or worse yet, injury of some kind, is abhorrent to the Lord, right? It is abhorrent to the Word. It's abhorrent to our sensitivities, our sensibilities, I think, if we're right thinking. So this idea of that symbol of authority that lets the child know, because you will get let know, right? If that child leaves your household without a sense of authority, then they will find out eventually that authority exists, and it will be far more uncomfortable than that gentle, loving spanking done by a parent. That you're imprisoned, or that you get knocked out by the police, or whatever it is. You can find that if you don't have a right authority orientation, then you're not going to succeed in life. but I would love to mention just a few tips, and I'd love to hear you guys' tips as well. I would recommend never disciplining physically in anger. If your emotions are a part of the equation, then you're probably not seeking to discipline, that is, correct a behavior or correct a thinking. You're seeking to get justice or revenge for the discomfort or frustration that's caused you, and that's inappropriate. That is not the way in which we seek to rightly accomplish God's goals. And again, back to that point, discipline, one, is not just punishment. In fact, I would dissociate those two ideas very heavily. Discipline is not about getting what you deserve. Discipline is about changing those behaviors that are destructive to self and to others. It's about the formation of character, and it's about becoming the person, or helping them become the person that God intended them to be. And so if our goals in discipline are to show our dissatisfaction or our frustration in a physical way, then we're probably doing something very wrong, profoundly wrong, because then the lesson isn't what behavior do I need to correct, or what thought do I need to correct. The new thought is, how do I keep from making dad mad? And that's not really the goal that we're hoping to achieve, right? Because ultimately they'll be out of the house, and they need those character lessons that you've taught them, not just living in, tiptoeing phobic fear of your father, but rather a respect for authority as a tool to shape us into the people that God wants us to be. So anybody else have any other good discipline tips?
Well, I just want to comment on that because I heartily agree. I think we as Christians think of discipline as the punishment. Well, if you think of it in that realm, what punishment is, as your child is new to the world, they're pushing those boundaries, seeing where their world is, what are the parameters, the boundaries. Punishment sets those boundaries for them. But if that's all we do, or all we think of discipline, what we're basically training them to understand is that you live life on the edge. You push those boundaries, see where those are, rather than, I think, a important aspect of discipline is preemptive. We're training, teaching, educating, counseling, giving wisdom, so that they learn not to live on the boundaries of what's right or wrong, but they live in the realm that God has designed them to live in.
Amen.
Yeah. You're talking about tips and things like that. I know in our household, it was important to us that whenever we gave a consequence, whatever it was, if it was a grounding or if it was spanking or whatever, that we would always give the moral imperative for why we are doing what we're doing. That we wouldn't just say, I'm doing this, I want you to do this, or I'm doing this because I said so, or I want you to do this because I said so. No, we're doing this because we as your parents have the responsibility to train you. And, I would always tell, it's so funny, I would always tell Wisdom, who's my daughter, for those who don't know, I was like, Wisdom, you have power. You have power to do whatever you want to, but you need to learn how to use that power wisely, or we have to use our power to stop you. So make sure that you use the power that you've been given. Make sure you use that well, right? Because, just like Bradley said, if you leave the house, sure, you have ability, you have influence, but there are people with much greater influence than you that can use their influence to stop you, right? And the consequence may be way harsher and way more punitive than us, right? We always sought to try to give the reasoning for why we were doing what we were doing, why we were disciplining her, why we were instructing her, so that it wasn't just I'm dad, do what I say, because I could be telling her to do something, it could be wrong. But to always try to give the reasoning behind that so that she would have a full understanding. And I think she respected us for that. So.
And I'm sure Jacob, you'll know this, and Luther's at the disadvantage because he only has one, and so we have multiples. And one of the beauties of discipline is this: early on, newborn, obviously you're not really doing any much discipline, you're just kind of goo gagging. But once they start turning into a little sinner, which is around 6 months, they're not going to respond necessarily to talking. That's where the little bit of love taps, something to get their attention. You don't need to wail, of course. I always tell people, like, beating does not suffice. So what discipline is supposed to entail. But when they get a little bit older and they're able to have some type of cognitive conversation, you need to tell them why, and you need to explain to them. And so to buffer the not disciplining and anger, what I learned to do when I was a new dad and had young children was I had to explain myself before any type of physical discipline took place, even if it was a timeout, even if it was, some type of other non-physical corporal punishment. I had to explain myself to my child before it actually took place. And sometimes it was, why you're getting this. Yes, I know why I'm getting this. Okay. What is going on here. But one of the things that Sarah and I instituted very early, because we never wanted our children to pit each other against each other, was the hand that disciplines is the hand that loves. That if you discipline, the child and the parent have to make things right. It has to be okay before they can go to the other parent and get love or comfort. That we have to say our sorries, we have to go ahead and get our love, and we have to be okay with one another before we can move on from that situation. So that's one of the things I always instituted. I always tell parents, hand that disciplines, hand that loves. But also, when it comes down to discipline, not all discipline is equal. One child responds to the little love taps, and I call them love taps, not spankings, because yes, it's physical. But you should do it in love, not in punishment. But some kids are like, yeah, spank me all you want. I don't care. Got to find what gets their attention. The authority has to be something that they learn the authority from. For Serenity, and I hope you don't mind me telling this, it was a fuzzy purple telephone. She loved that purple fuzzy telephone. She's 4 years old. She lived for that telephone. When she was bad, we took the telephone away. She didn't spank her all she wants. She didn't care. Take the telephone. That's what got her attention. And so you have to almost find what influences the child, what gets their attention, what helps them learn, to understand authority and to understand that there's roles and responsibilities within society, within this household. So there's a lot of things we could talk about in regards to tips. That's one of my favorite ones. It's always going to be different by child as they get older. And the hand that disciplines is the hand that loves. Regardless of what the discipline is, it has to be made right with that parent first. You can't sit there. And as dads, here's what we do, right? We come home from work. Mom says, hey, little Bradley there, he was a snot today, and he got punished. Got his discipline. And we were like, oh, let me double down on that. No. If it was handled, you're like, oh, did you learn your lesson? You engage the conversation, but you don't rediscipline something that's been disciplined. So that's the three things that I always want to convey to parents. You don't rehash something that's already been dealt with. If it's been dealt with, it's been dealt with. If you think it's not been dealt with properly, you have that conversation separately, but you don't double down on the punishment.
I want to speak to that because I think it's really important, and it ties into another thought I had, in that I think you see a microcosm within the family with, in the Old Testament, you have Israel and the leadership, and, talking of Proverbs. Well, the reason we have that wisdom is because Solomon asked God for it. And the reason he asked God for wisdom was that he might rule God's people well. And so I think there's a microcosm in the family where we're needing to parent our children well. And so to your point, that requires wisdom in every situation. And, we think of the famous Solomon judgment with the two wives and the baby. And he says, well, cut the baby in half. Obviously it wasn't literally advocating for that, but in wisdom, that's how he determined what the solution should be and who the mom was. And so applying that to our parenting, just knowing our children, knowing what they are moved by, and acting accordingly. Another quick tip that I thought of, we actually got this from a our friends in Bible school, her dad is a pastor, and this was excellent, but he said, never spank with your hand, always use something else. That way it's separated from you. So it's kind of similar to what you said, Will, the hand that loves and the hand that punishes. And we've implemented that. And what I've found interesting is with our boys, who we've got 3 boys, all under 6. And so lots of spankings occur at our house. Never once have they been afraid of me or shied away. In fact, their initial response after being spanked is to melt into my arms. And that's always been really encouraging to me, is that they're getting the message that what they did was wrong, but they're also getting the more important message that I'm doing this because I love you. You know, as parents say, I'm doing this because I love you. It's true, obviously, but the child, they don't maybe hear that in the moment. And so just doing what you can practically to communicate those messages.
Don't use cliche. This is going to hurt you, or hurt me way more than it's going to hurt you. I always said the opposite. It's going to hurt you way more than it's going to hurt me. You know, but I understand the principle behind that kind of statement, because you don't want to see your children hurt. But to be honest, kids don't buy that. No, we didn't buy that when we were kids. So always, I think instead of using cliche, express true intent. Why are we doing this? What's going on? And I'll be honest with you, once the kids started getting older and spanking was inappropriate, I don't know when each child was done, but it was done at different times based upon the needs of the child. The late night conversations till 3 o'clock in the morning. Luther knows what I'm talking about. I'm sure Brad does too. Jacob, it's coming. When you have a preteen, a teenager, that you're trying to help them understand the way they think, is a lot harder as a parent than simply a simple disciplinary, like table of offenses, 2 weeks detention, 2 weeks grounding, whatever it may be. But actually getting into the root of the problem and trying to figure out why are you thinking this way, and trying to help them understand it and try to figure out the way to address those situations. Much harder. And I would say it was all worth it. So every time we did that. Now the kids still mock it to this day. Oh, we go down to the bedroom. Okay, let's talk. And they're like, okay, let's go ahead and light a candle. It's going to be here for a while, type of thing. But having those conversations, engaging with them mentally, trying to figure out what's going on, and not just resorting automatically to a form of discipline that is punitive, I find it to be a lot more beneficial. So along those lines, talking, understanding, communicating, letting them know expectations, being consistent. If you're not consistent in discipline, you're just going to confuse people.
And I would add,
I think
maintain your. Oh, go ahead, Luther. Say.
I'm just saying that the aspect of grace, I think, is important, particularly when they get older, and you can't, physically discipline them like you used to. Were those, around the table with the candles to express that, you messed up big time with this decision. You really did. And the consequences of this, you're going to have to bear them for a while. And I want you to know that I love you, your mother loves you, and you are still a saint, irrespective of what has happened, right? And that we're here to walk alongside of you, and we're not going to bear it for you, but we are going to walk alongside of you and continue to encourage you, because that's what you need right now. Your consequences are you don't need a
significant.
Consequences are far worse than this, right? But to continue to know that your position in Christ is secure, and you're okay, and you're okay with us. So
you want to say, Brad?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to kind of, in pushing the conversation forward, pointing out that we need to keep your goals in mind. Your goal in disciplining a child, they're not going to be 3, 4, 5, 10, 11, 16 forever. That's a short part of the process towards ultimately bringing them to adulthood. So it's really important, I think, as parents, when we oftentimes will maybe take away privileges or freedoms when we're dealing with those uncomfortable situations. But really what we're hoping to do is train them to deal with freedom, right? To deal with the ultimate freedom that they're going to have. So, a constant concern for many families today is how do we deal with technology, with the tablets and screens and all that business? And you can take the route of saying, well, you're never going to see a screen. You're never going to see a tablet. You're never going to see it. And you will effectively have not trained them to live in the world that, whether happily or sadly, they're going to need to live in, right?
Mhm.
They're going to need, for the most part, to deal with and learn how to deal with computers. So you can completely retard them in that and make it impossible for them to to manage that when they go forward, or you can, through the various boundaries that you set, train them to use those tools responsibly as tools. And I think a lot of times we run into the danger of, if you're teaching your child, your son, to build and fix things, and you see that he uses a saw inappropriately, or a drill press or something inappropriately in a way that's dangerous to them, you don't then say, all right, well, you're out of the shop. Never again. No, your whole goal is to train them to use that appropriately, and some discipline, even some serious discipline, because of the risk to them, might need to be used or utilized. But ultimately remembering that you are trying to train a person who is able to manage their sleep schedule, able to have a work ethic, able to interact meaningfully in society. And you don't learn that by taking away responsibilities. You learn that by correcting them within the context of that responsibility. Now, please, don't put your kids on social media, like, make those good boundaries. I'm not suggesting a no holds barred. In fact, quite to the contrary. How you control that and how you train them to deal with those things is precisely the point, because once they're out of your house, they're going to make their decisions about alcohol consumption. They're going to make their decisions about how they spend their money or whether or not they budget. They're going to make their decisions about whether they get a good night's sleep, and so on and so forth. And some of those might be hard lessons that they have to learn. But ultimately, at the end of the day, our goal is, in our family, and I know yours as well, is to create adult humans who know how to honor God and love and live meaningfully and productively. And therefore, your discipline has to reflect that. It can't just be I don't like that behavior. I don't like that the kid's doing that. I'm going to stop that. It's, how can I prepare this child to abandon the actions and attitudes that are going to bring destruction to them and dishonor to God?
Yeah. And that brings us to I would say, a verse that we can just kind of look at a couple times, because I think a lot of fathers out there misconstrue. I wanted to talk about the rod, because I think that's misconstrued. It's not a beating stick. It's a sign of authority. It's an opportunity to exercise that so that they learn, from the authority in the house. But also, you get down to Ephesians 6:4. Again, I'm going to ask the question. Whoever wants to take it on. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. What does it mean to provoke your children to anger? What's that in context, and what is that dealing with? Is it just, if a child gets angry with you, does that mean you failed?
I think we've kind of touched on it, that
A little bit.
essentially to stir or to provoke one to become wrathful, right? So think about a dad who abuses his child, right? Or think about a dad who abuses or neglects his kid, right? Or verbally insults them, berates them. You're literally stoking one's anger when you do that. You know what I'm saying? Particularly in children, right? Your authority, your strength is not to be used to bludgeon another or subjugate another, particularly your children, right? It is meant to protect, to guide, to instruct. So I think that's what he's talking about there. Do not, don't use your influence or your ability or your power to cause your child to be angry or to become wrathful, right? For destruction. Instead, be intentional and train your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord.
Yeah.
We've touched on it several times.
We have. Yep. Just was one of the things I wanted to just point out was this verse itself is used a lot of times to not be forthright, to not be stern, to be solid, because I don't want to provoke my children to anger. No, your behavior is what provokes them to anger. So it's like, if you're wrathful, they're going to be wrathful. And so if you're beating them, they're going to be wrathful themselves. That's a very valuable point. And it obviously, and Clint closes up with Ephesians 6:4, bring them in discipline and instruction of the Lord. It has to do with learning, and this word instruction, admonition in the King James, New King James, deals with the concepts of appreciation and understanding of the actual information that God provides. So we are out of time. So we will go ahead, and I want to go ahead and again appreciate all of you, Brad, the book itself, leading us to a good framework for it. I hope that everyone here who's listening to this in some form or another, this is designed to allow you to continue the conversation. We're not going to answer all the questions here. It allows you to be able to get a framework down so that you can go ahead and hopefully be able to have meaningful conversations with individuals who you trust, whether it be one of us or someone else within your community. But of course, you can always reach out to us. We'll be happy to give you some advice, some helps, and some instruction in the Lord as well. All right, everyone, thank you very much, and God bless.